The gunshot that killed Deacon Xavier's father rang out on a Tuesday morning, and by Wednesday noon, Deacon was riding through the dusty streets of Victor, Colorado with nothing but his father's horse, a worn saddle, and $17 to his name. The year was 1883, and at 24 years old, Deacon found himself completely alone in a world that had never been particularly kind to begin with. His father had been a ranch hand most of his life, working himself to the bone for other men's dreams until a claim dispute turned violent and left Deacon orphaned. The horse beneath him, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Copper, was the only living creature Deacon trusted anymore. Victor sat nestled in the mountains at nearly 10,000 feet, a mining town that had exploded with the discovery of gold just 2 years prior. The streets teemed with prospectors, gamblers, painted ladies, and men looking to make their fortunes any way they could. Deacon had no interest in gold. He needed work, steady work that would keep him and Copper fed until he could figure out what came next. His stomach had been empty since yesterday morning, a familiar gnawing sensation that he had learned to ignore over the years. But Copper needed grain and hay, and that came first. It always came first. He dismounted outside the livery stable, his boots hitting the ground with a soft thud. The stable master, a portly man with a thick gray beard, eyed him with the particular suspicion reserved for drifters and men who looked like they could not afford his services. "Need to board my horse," Deacon said, his voice rough from disuse. "Just for a few days while I find work." $2 a day, grain included, the stable master said, crossing his arms. Deacon's jaw tightened. 4 days would take more than half his money, and he still needed to eat, needed a place to sleep. But Copper's ribs were already starting to show, and the horse had carried him faithfully for 3 hard days of riding. "Can I work it off? I'm good with horses, good with my hands." The stable master looked him up and down, seemed to consider it, then shook his head. "Got all the help I need, cash or move along." Deacon counted out $6, enough for 3 days. It would have to be enough time to find something. The stable master took the money and gestured toward an empty stall. Deacon led Copper inside, removed the saddle and bridle with careful hands, and spent the next 20 minutes brushing the horse down, checking his hooves, making sure he had fresh water. Only when Copper was contentedly eating his first real meal in days did Deacon allow himself to leave. The sun was high and hot despite the mountain altitude, and Deacon's head felt light as he walked down the main street. He needed food, but more than that, he needed work. Food could wait another day if it had to. He stopped at a saloon advertising work for security, but they took one look at his gaunt frame and worn clothes and sent him away. The general store needed someone to haul freight, but the position had been filled that morning. The mine foreman laughed in his face when he asked about work underground. By the time the sun started its descent behind the western peaks, Deacon had been turned away from every establishment in town. His head pounded, his vision swimming slightly at the edges. He had not eaten in nearly 2 days now, and his body was starting to protest in earnest, but at least Copper was fed and safe. That was what mattered. He found a spot behind the general store where he could sleep without being hassled, a narrow space between the building and a fence where the ground was relatively soft. He used his saddle as a pillow and tried to ignore the way his stomach cramped and twisted. Tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow he would find something. Sleep came in fits and starts, interrupted by the cold mountain night and the sounds of the town's nightlife. When dawn finally broke, Deacon was stiff and exhausted, but he forced himself up and went to check on Copper before doing anything else. The horse nickered when he saw him, and Deacon spent a few precious minutes stroking his neck and talking to him in low tones. "We will figure this out, boy," he murmured. "I promise." He made another round of the businesses, this time expanding his search to the edges of town. A restaurant owner told him to come back in a week. A laundry service said they only hired women. A freight company said they might have something next month. Deacon's stomach had moved past hunger into a hollow, aching emptiness that made every step feel like wading through water. It was midday when he found himself standing outside a small boarding house on the eastern edge of town. The sign out front advertised rooms for rent and meals served daily. The building was well maintained, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, and flower boxes filled with late summer blooms sat beneath each window. It looked like the kind of place that would never hire someone like him, but Deacon was desperate enough to try anyway. He knocked on the front door, and a moment later it swung open to reveal a young woman with auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun and eyes the color of summer grass. She wore a simple dress covered by an apron, and flour dusted her hands and forearms. She looked to be about his age, maybe a year or two younger, with a face that was pretty in an honest, unadorned way. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice pleasant but cautious. "I am looking for work," Deacon said, removing his hat. "Anything you might need. I can fix things, chop wood, haul water. I am a hard worker." The young woman studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his hollow cheeks and the way he swayed slightly on his feet. "When did you last eat?" The question caught him off guard. "That is not important. I just need work." "It is important if you're going to faint on my doorstep," she said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than pitying. "Wait here." She disappeared inside before Deacon could protest, leaving him standing on the porch feeling foolish and increasingly unsteady. He considered leaving, but his legs did not seem inclined to cooperate. A few minutes later, the woman returned with a plate piled high with bread, cheese, and cold chicken, along with a tall glass of water. "Eat this," she said, pushing it into his hands. "Then we can talk about work." Deacon's pride warred with his hunger, and hunger won decisively. He tried to eat slowly to maintain some dignity, but the food was gone in minutes. The woman watched without comment, her expression unreadable. "Thank you," he managed when he finished, his voice rough with emotion he did not want to show. "I will work off every cent of that." "My name is Flora Whitmore," she said, taking the empty plate. "I run this boarding house with my aunt. We have been needing someone to help with the heavy work, and our last handyman left for the goldfields 3 weeks ago. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board, 3 meals a day, and a bed in the room off the kitchen, if you are interested." Deacon felt something like hope flicker in his chest. "I am interested, very interested. My name is Deacon Xavier." "Do you drink, Deacon Xavier?" Flora asked, her green eyes sharp and assessing. "No, madam." "Gamble?" "No, madam." "Are you running from the law?" "No, madam. My father was killed in a claim dispute outside Denver. I'm just looking for honest work and a fresh start." Flora nodded slowly. "I am sorry about your father. The job is yours if you want it. You can start tomorrow morning. The room is available tonight." "I have a horse," Deacon said quickly. "He is at the livery, but I only paid for 3 days. I need to make sure he is taken care of." Something shifted in Flora's expression, a softening around her eyes. "Bring your horse here. We have a small barn out back. It is just used for storage now, but there is room for a horse. You can keep him here as part of your arrangement." Deacon felt his throat tighten. That is very generous. "A man who makes sure his horse is fed before himself is the kind of man worth helping," Flora said simply. "Go get your horse and your things. Supper is at 6. Do not be late." Deacon made it halfway down the street before his legs gave out, and he had to sit on a bench to collect himself. The food had helped, but his body was still recovering from 2 days without sustenance. He sat there for several minutes, watching the town go about its business, feeling the first real sense of relief he had experienced since his father died. He had work, he had a place to sleep, and Copper would be taken care of. When he felt steady enough, he walked to the livery stable and explained the situation to the stable master, who seemed happy enough to be rid of a customer he had clearly thought would not be able to pay. Deacon saddled Copper, tied his few belongings behind the saddle, and led the horse through the streets back to the yellow boarding house. Flora met him at the barn, which was indeed small but clean and dry, with a stall at one end and various supplies stacked at the other. "There is hay in the loft," she said, pointing upward, "and I will bring grain from the general store tomorrow. For tonight the hay should be sufficient." "This is more than sufficient," Deacon said, already leading Copper into the stall. "Thank you, Miss Whitmore." "Flora," she corrected, "we are not formal here." She left him to get Copper settled, and Deacon took his time, making sure the horse had plenty of hay and fresh water, brushing him down again, even though it was not strictly necessary. Copper seemed content with the new arrangement, and that was enough for Deacon. His room was indeed off the kitchen, a small space with a narrow bed, a bureau, and a washstand. It was clean and warm, and the bed had actual sheets and a quilt. Deacon sat on the edge of the bed and put his head in his hands, allowing himself one moment of overwhelming gratitude before washing up for supper. The dining room was filled when he emerged at 6. The boarding house apparently catered to miners and tradesmen, and a dozen men sat around the long table talking and laughing. Flora and an older woman who must have been her aunt moved between the kitchen and dining room with practiced efficiency, carrying platters of food and pitchers of water. Deacon took an empty seat near the end of the table, feeling out of place but too hungry to care. The food was simple but plentiful: roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. Deacon ate steadily, listening to the conversations around him without participating. The miners talked about yields and new claims. A carpenter discussed a church he was building. A freight driver complained about the condition of the roads. Flora appeared at his elbow with a second helping of chicken and potatoes before he could ask. "You look like you could use it," she said quietly. "Thank you," Deacon said, meeting her eyes. She held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then moved on to tend to the other boarders. After supper, Deacon helped clear the table without being asked, carrying dishes into the kitchen where Flora and her aunt were already washing up. The older woman introduced herself as Beatrice Whitmore, a sturdy woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. "Flora says you are our new handyman," Beatrice said, scrubbing a plate with vigor. "I hope you are as good as she seems to think." "I will do my best, madam," Deacon replied. "See that you do. We have a list of repairs as long as my arm. You can start with the fence out back. Half of it fell down in the last storm." Deacon nodded, and Beatrice dismissed him with a wave. He retreated to his small room, exhausted but feeling more settled than he had in weeks. He checked on Copper one more time before bed, then fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. Dawn came early. Deacon woke to the sound of Flora moving around in the kitchen, the smell of coffee and frying bacon drawing him from sleep. He dressed quickly and found her at the stove, her hair already pinned up, her apron tied neatly around her waist. "Morning," she said without turning around. "Coffee is on the table. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes. "Can I help?" Deacon asked. "You can feed your horse. I imagine you would like to do that first anyway." She was not wrong. Deacon poured himself a cup of coffee, black and strong, and took it out to the barn. Copper was already awake, and Deacon gave him a thorough grooming before measuring out grain from the new bag Flora must have purchased that morning. He stood there drinking his coffee, watching Copper eat, feeling a sense of peace he had not experienced in a long time. Breakfast was eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and fresh biscuits with butter and jam. The boarders ate quickly, most of them heading out to their various jobs before the sun had fully risen. Deacon helped clear the table again, then waited for his instructions. Beatrice handed him a hammer, nails, and a saw. "The fence first, then the back steps need reinforcing. After that, there is a leak in the roof of the storage shed. Think you can manage all that?" "Yes, madam." "Good. Flora will bring you lunch at noon. Do not work yourself to death in this heat." Deacon spent the morning working on the fence, replacing broken boards and reinforcing weak posts. The work was physical and satisfying, and he lost himself in the rhythm of it. The sun climbed higher, and sweat soaked through his shirt, but he kept going. At noon, Flora appeared with a tray containing sandwiches, cold lemonade, and cookies. She set it down on the back step and watched him work for a moment. "You do not have to do it all in one day," she said. "I know, but I do not mind. It feels good to work." Flora nodded, understanding in her expression. "My father used to say the same thing. He died 5 years ago. Pneumonia. My mother passed when I was a child, so it was just him and me for a long time. When he died, my aunt took me in and we started this boarding house together." Deacon set down his hammer and moved to the steps, picking up a sandwich. "I am sorry about your father. Mine was all I had, too. Then you understand, Flora said simply. She sat down on the step beside him, not seeming to mind the impropriety of it. Aunt Beatrice means well, but she can be hard. Do not let her frighten you off. I have dealt with worse than hard bosses, Deacon assured her. Besides, I owe you both. You did not have to help me. You looked like you needed help. And like I said, a man who takes care of his horse first is worth helping. Flora glanced toward the barn. What is his name? Copper. He was my father's horse. 15 years old, steady as they come. Will you introduce me? Flora asked. I've always liked horses, but we have never had reason to keep one. Deacon nodded, and they walked to the barn together after he finished eating. Copper lifted his head when they entered, and Deacon ran a hand down the horse's neck. Copper, this is Flora. Flora, this is Copper. Flora reached out tentatively, letting Copper sniff her hand before stroking his nose. He is beautiful. You can tell he is well cared for. He's all I have left of my father. That, and a few memories. Flora looked at him, her green eyes soft. Then he is precious indeed. I will make sure we always have grain for him. Consider it part of your wages. You do not have to do that. I know I do not have to. I want to. Flora gave Copper one last pat, then stepped back. I should get back to work. We have pies to bake this afternoon. Deacon watched her go, something warm and unfamiliar settling in his chest. He had spent so long taking care of himself and Copper, expecting nothing from anyone, that Flora's simple kindness felt almost overwhelming. He returned to his work with renewed energy, determined to prove that her faith in him was not misplaced. The day settled into a rhythm. Deacon worked from dawn until dusk, tackling the long list of repairs and maintenance that the boarding house needed. He fixed the roof, reinforced the steps, replaced broken windows, and built new shelves in the storage room. Beatrice was demanding but fair, and she paid him every Friday in cash, along with his room and board. Flora was a constant, quiet presence. She cooked 3 meals a day for the boarders, cleaned, did laundry, and managed the household accounts. But she also found time to check on Deacon throughout the day, bringing him water when the sun was hot, sitting with him during lunch to talk about nothing in particular. She asked about his life, his father, his dreams, and she shared her own stories in return. She told him about growing up in a small farming community in Kansas, how her mother died in childbirth when Flora was 6, leaving her father to raise her alone. She talked about learning to cook at her father's side, about the garden they kept together, about the way he taught her to read using the family Bible and old newspapers. When he died, she had been 19 and alone, with no skills except cooking and managing a household. Beatrice had been her mother's sister, and she had come to Victor to help her aunt establish the boarding house. I never thought I would end up in Colorado, Flora said one afternoon, sitting on the back step while Deacon took a break from painting the barn. But I like it here. The mountains make me feel safe somehow, like they are protecting us from the rest of the world. I know what you mean, Deacon said. There's something about this place, it feels different from other towns. Will you stay? Flora asked, her eyes searching his face. Or will you move on when you have enough money saved? Deacon considered the question. A month ago, he would have said he would keep moving, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. But now, with steady work and a place that felt almost like home, he found his answer had changed. I will stay, for as long as you will have me. Flora smiled, a genuine, bright expression that made his heart skip. I am glad. The weeks turned into months. Summer faded into autumn, and the aspen trees on the mountainsides turned gold and crimson. The boarding house stayed full as miners rushed to get in a final few weeks of work before winter closed the high country. Deacon had put on weight, his hollow cheeks filling out, his frame growing stronger with regular meals and hard work. Copper was sleek and healthy, and Deacon often took him out for rides on his day off, sometimes alone, sometimes with Flora riding double behind him. Those rides became Deacon's favorite part of the week. Flora would wrap her arms around his waist, her body warm against his back, and they would ride out into the mountains, exploring old mining trails and hidden meadows. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing their hopes and fears, their past regrets and future dreams. Deacon found himself looking forward to those moments with an intensity that surprised him. It was on one of those rides, in late October with the air crisp and cold, that Deacon realized he was in love with her. They had stopped by a stream to let Copper drink, and Flora had wandered off to pick the last wildflowers of the season. She looked beautiful in the golden afternoon light, her hair escaping its pins, her cheeks flushed from the cold. When she turned and smiled at him holding up a handful of purple asters, Deacon felt his heart constrict with an emotion so powerful it almost hurt. He loved her. He loved her kindness, her strength, her quiet competence. He loved the way she hummed while she cooked, the way she checked on Copper every morning, the way she looked at him like he was worth something. But he had nothing to offer her except a horse, some saved wages, and a past marked by loss. She deserved better than a handyman with no prospects. Still, he could not stop himself from moving closer, from taking the flowers from her hands and tucking one behind her ear. "You look beautiful," he said, the words coming out rough and uncertain. Flora's breath caught, her green eyes widening. "Deacon, I know I should not say that. I know I have no right. But it is the truth, and I'm tired of hiding it." "You think you have no right?" Flora asked, her voice shaking slightly. "Deacon, I have been waiting for months for you to say something. Anything." "You have?" Deacon stared at her, hardly daring to believe. "You really are dense, are you not?" Flora said, but she was smiling. "I do not bring lunch to just anyone. I do not spend my one afternoon off riding around the mountains with just anyone. I thought I was being obvious." "I thought you were just being kind. You are kind to everyone." "I am not in love with everyone," Flora said, and the words hung in the air between them, precious and terrifying. Deacon reached for her, his hands shaking as he cupped her face. "Say that again." "I am in love with you, Deacon Xavier. I have been for weeks now, maybe longer. I love the way you take care of Copper, the way you work so hard, the way you never complain. I love talking to you. I love being near you. I just love you." Deacon kissed her then, slow and careful, like she was something precious he might break. Flora kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment nothing else existed except the two of them and the cold mountain air and the sound of the stream nearby. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Flora laughed softly. "We should probably head back before Aunt Beatrice sends out a search party." "Probably," Deacon agreed, but he kissed her again anyway, unable to help himself. They rode back as the sun set, Flora's arms tight around his waist, and Deacon felt like his heart might burst from the fullness of it all. He had lost so much, but he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found home. Beatrice took one look at them when they returned and shook her head, but there was a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "About time," was all she said. The next few months were the happiest of Deacon's life. He and Flora courted properly, despite living under the same roof, taking evening walks through town and attending church socials together. Beatrice proved to be a surprisingly lenient chaperone, trusting them to behave with propriety while clearly approving of the match. "That girl needs someone who will appreciate her," Beatrice told Deacon one evening. "She has spent too much of her life taking care of others. You make sure you take care of her too." "I will," Deacon promised, "for the rest of my life if she will have me." "Then you had better ask her properly, had you not?" Deacon had been saving his wages carefully, and by December he had enough to buy a simple gold band from the jeweler in town. He planned to ask Flora on Christmas Day, but his nerves got the better of him, and he ended up proposing on Christmas Eve instead after the boarders had all retired for the night. They were in the kitchen, Flora washing the last of the dishes while Deacon dried. It was a domestic scene, comfortable and familiar, and Deacon could picture a lifetime of nights just like this one. "Flora," he said, setting down the dish towel with hands that shook slightly, I need to ask you something." She turned to face him, her hands still wet, her expression curious. "What is it?" Deacon pulled the ring from his pocket and dropped to one knee. "I know I'm not much, just a handyman with a horse and some saved money, but I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone. You saved my life, Flora, not just by giving me food and work, but by seeing something in me worth saving. I want to spend the rest of my life making you as happy as you have made me. Will you marry me?" Flora's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, of course I will marry you, and you are wrong, Deacon. You are not just anything. You are everything." She pulled him to his feet and kissed him, and Deacon slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands. It fit perfectly. They were married in February of 1884 in the small church at the center of Victor. Beatrice cried through the entire ceremony, and half the boarding house residents attended as witnesses. Flora wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Deacon wore his best suit, carefully brushed and pressed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Deacon kissed her like she was air, and he was drowning, and the congregation erupted in applause. The boarding house became fully theirs when Beatrice announced she was moving to Denver to live with her other sister. "This place needs young blood," she said firmly. "You two will do well here. Just promise me you will take care of it." "We promise," Flora said, hugging her aunt tightly. "And name your first child after me if it is a girl," Beatrice added with a wink. They took over the boarding house, running it together with the same efficiency and care that Beatrice and Flora had established. Deacon handled the maintenance and the business side of things, while Flora managed the cooking and household matters. They made a good team, anticipating each other's needs, supporting each other through the hard days, and celebrating the good ones. But Flora never forgot that first day when Deacon had come to her door hollow-eyed and desperate, making sure his horse was fed before himself. She made it her mission to ensure that both Deacon and Copper were always well cared for. She cooked Deacon's favorite meals, made sure he rested when he pushed himself too hard, and always kept a bag of apples on hand for Copper. "You take care of everyone else," she told Deacon one evening, watching him brush Copper down after a long day. "Someone needs to take care of you." "I have you for that," Deacon said, pulling her close. "I still do not know what I did to deserve you." "You were kind to a horse," Flora said simply, "and that told me everything I needed to know about your character." Their first child was born in December of 1884, a healthy boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Daniel, and Deacon held him with shaking hands, overwhelmed by the responsibility and love he felt for this tiny person. "He is perfect," Flora whispered, exhausted but radiant. "He is," Deacon agreed, kissing her forehead. "Thank you. For him, for everything. I love you so much." "I love you too. Now hand him over. He needs to eat." Life settled into a new rhythm, this one punctuated by midnight feedings and diaper changes. The boarding house thrived, and Deacon and Flora earned a reputation for running one of the best establishments in Victor. They treated their boarders like family, and many of them returned year after year, specifically requesting rooms at the Whitmore boarding house. Copper grew older, but remained a constant presence. Daniel learned to walk by holding onto Copper's mane, and the patient horse never once spooked or stepped wrong. Flora brought him carrots and apples every day, and Deacon made sure he had the best care possible. The horse had carried him to Victor, to Flora, to this life, and Deacon would never forget that. Their second child, a daughter they named Beatrice after Flora's aunt, was born in 1886. She had her father's stubborn streak and her mother's quick mind, and she kept them on their toes from the moment she could crawl. A third child, another boy named Thomas, followed in 1888, completing their family. The years passed quickly, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Daniel started school, showing a quick aptitude for numbers. Beatrice declared she wanted to be a cook like her mother. Thomas was quieter than his siblings, content to spend hours in the barn with Copper, mimicking his father's gentle care of the horse. In 1892, Copper passed away peacefully in his sleep. He was 24 years old, ancient for a horse, and he had lived a good life. Deacon found him in the morning, lying in his stall as though he had simply decided to rest and never woken up. He sat beside the horse for a long time, his hand on Copper's neck, saying goodbye to the last physical connection to his father. Flora found him there, their 3 children trailing behind her. She did not say anything, just sat down beside him and took his hand. Daniel, Beatrice, and Thomas sat down too, forming a circle around the horse that had been part of their family for as long as they could remember. "He was a good horse," Daniel said quietly. "The best," Deacon agreed, his voice thick. "He brought me to your mother. He brought me to all of you. I owe him everything." They buried Copper behind the barn, under an aspen tree that turned gold every autumn. Deacon carved a simple marker: Copper, faithful friend, 1868-1892. Flora planted wildflowers around the grave, and the children visited it often, leaving carrots and apples like offerings. The loss of Copper hit Deacon harder than he expected, bringing back memories of his father's death and that desperate ride to Victor 9 years earlier. But Flora was there, as she always was, making sure he ate, making sure he rested, pulling him back from the edge of grief with her steady presence. "You gave him a good life," she told him one night, holding him while he finally let himself cry. "He was happy. He was loved. That is all any of us can ask for." "I just miss him," Deacon admitted. "I know, we all do. But he is not really gone, Deacon. He is in this house, in our family, in the life we built. He brought you to me, and look at everything that came from that. He will always be a part of us." Flora was right, as she usually was. Copper's legacy lived on in the boarding house they had built together, in the 3 children who had learned compassion and responsibility by caring for him, in the love story that had started with a man who fed his horse before himself, and a woman who made sure both of them ate well. Victor continued to grow and thrive as a mining town. The boarding house expanded, and Deacon built additional rooms to accommodate more guests. Daniel showed an interest in the business side of things, often helping his father with accounts and maintenance. Beatrice spent all her time in the kitchen with Flora, learning recipes and techniques. Thomas talked about becoming a veterinarian someday, inspired by his father's care for Copper. In 1895, Beatrice Sr. passed away in Denver. She was 71 years old and had lived a full life. Flora traveled to Denver for the funeral, taking the children with her, and Deacon stayed behind to manage the boarding house. When they returned, Flora was quiet and thoughtful. "She told me something before she died," Flora said that night, lying in bed beside him. "She said she knew from the first day she met you that you were the right man for me. She said any man who would go hungry to feed his horse was a man who would take care of his family." "She was wrong about one thing," Deacon said, pulling Flora closer. "I did not just take care of my family. You took care of me right back. We took care of each other." "That is what marriage is," Flora agreed, "taking care of each other." They celebrated their 12th wedding anniversary in February of 1896. Their marriage had been marked by hard work, mutual respect, and a love that had only deepened with time. They still took evening walks when the weather allowed, still sat together in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, still looked at each other like they were discovering something wonderful and new. The children grew into young adults with goals and dreams of their own. Daniel left for Denver in 1898 to study business, promising to return and help expand the boarding house into a proper hotel someday. Beatrice took over most of the cooking, her skills surpassing even Flora's. Thomas apprenticed with the town veterinarian, working with horses and cattle throughout the region. Through it all, Deacon and Flora remained the steady center of their family. They had weathered loss and hardship, celebrated victories and milestones, and built a life that neither of them could have imagined in those early days. The boarding house was more than just a business. It was a home, a sanctuary, a place where people could find rest and care. One evening in 1900, as they sat on the back porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Flora leaned her head on Deacon's shoulder. Do you ever think about that first day? When you showed up at my door looking like a strong wind would blow you over? I think about it all the time, Deacon admitted. I think about how close I came to riding past this place to never stopping at all. What would have happened if I had kept going? But you did not keep going. You stopped. You asked for work. You fed your horse first. Flora smiled up at him. That is what caught my attention, you know. The stable master mentioned you, said some fool had spent most of his money boarding his horse when he clearly had not eaten in days. I thought anyone that devoted to an animal had to have a good heart. You saved my life that day, Deacon said, kissing the top of her head. I was about at the end of my rope. Another day or two, and I do not know what would have happened. We saved each other, Flora corrected. I was so lonely before you came, Deacon. Running this place with Aunt Beatrice was good work, but I felt like I was just going through the motions. Then you showed up, and suddenly everything had color again. Purpose, meaning. I love you, Deacon said, the words as true and essential as they had been the first time he said them 16 years earlier. I will love you until the day I die and beyond if there is anything after. I love you too, always and forever. They sat there until the stars came out, holding hands like young lovers, grateful for every moment that had led them to this place. The boarding house was quiet behind them, their children safe and happy, their life full of blessings they had earned through hard work and devotion to each other. In 1903, Daniel returned from Denver with a wife of his own and plans to help expand the family business. They broke ground on a new wing of the boarding house, adding 10 more rooms and a larger dining area. The town of Victor was at its peak, with over 18,000 residents and mines producing millions of dollars in gold every year. Beatrice married a mining engineer in 1904, a steady man who appreciated her cooking and her sharp wit. They built a house 2 streets over, close enough to visit daily but far enough to establish their own life. Thomas opened a veterinary practice in 1905, specializing in horses and working animals, and he credited his father's example with teaching him the importance of treating animals with respect and compassion. Deacon and Flora became grandparents in 1906 when Daniel and his wife welcomed a daughter. Flora cried when they named her Rose Flora, touched beyond words that her son wanted to honor her. More grandchildren followed over the years, filling the boarding house with laughter and noise and the chaos of family life. Through it all, Deacon and Flora worked side by side, their partnership as strong as ever. They had added on to the building several times, expanded their services, and earned a reputation throughout Colorado for hospitality and excellent food. But they never forgot their humble beginning, never forgot the lessons they had learned about taking care of each other and the importance of compassion. Deacon made it a policy to never turn away someone looking for work if they seemed genuine. He and Flora had helped dozens of young men over the years, offering them jobs and second chances the way Flora had once offered him. Many of them went on to successful lives, and they often returned to Victor to thank the couple who had believed in them. You are going to bankrupt us taking in every stray that comes to the door, Flora teased one evening, though her eyes were warm with approval. You took in a stray once, Deacon reminded her. Worked out pretty well, I think. That was different. I knew you were special from the start. How could you possibly know that? Flora pulled him close, standing on her toes to kiss him. Because you fed your horse before you fed yourself. Because you cared about something other than your own survival, even when you were desperate. That told me everything I needed to know. The town of Victor began to decline after 1910 as the gold ran out and mines closed. The population dropped and many businesses shuttered. But the boarding house remained, transitioning from catering to miners to serving tourists who came to see the mountains and experience a piece of the Old West. Deacon and Flora adapted with the times, always finding ways to keep the business viable. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, surrounded by their 3 children, their children's spouses, and 7 grandchildren. The party filled the boarding house, and Deacon gave a toast that had everyone laughing and crying in equal measure. 30 years ago, I was the luckiest man alive, and I did not even know it yet, he said, raising his glass to Flora. I was hungry, broke, and desperate, but I had a good horse and enough sense to make sure he was fed before I worried about myself. And that one decision led me to the love of my life. Flora saw something in me worth saving, and she has been taking care of me ever since. She made sure both Copper and I ate well, and she has been feeding my soul with her love every day for 3 decades. I love you, Flora Whitmore Xavier. Here is to 30 more years. To 30 more years, everyone echoed, and Flora wiped tears from her eyes as she kissed her husband. The years continued to pass, bringing both joy and sorrow. Deacon's health began to fail in his 60s, his years of hard work catching up with him. Flora nursed him through several serious illnesses, never complaining, always patient and loving. When he protested that she was doing too much, she simply smiled and reminded him that he had taken care of his horse first and she had promised to take care of him. You gave everything to make sure those you loved were cared for, she told him. Let me do the same for you. Deacon recovered each time, but he slowed down. Letting Daniel take over more of the business operations, he and Flora spent their days sitting on the porch, watching their grandchildren play, reminiscing about their life together. They talked about that first meeting, about Copper, about all the years in between. Every memory was precious, every moment a treasure. On a warm summer evening in 1923, Deacon and Flora sat on that same back porch where they had spent so many hours over the decades. They were in their mid-60s now, their hair gray, their bodies marked by time and hard work. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love on a mountainside 40 years earlier. Do you have any regrets? Flora asked, holding his hand. Not a single one, Deacon said honestly. Every choice I made, every step I took led me here, led me to you. How could I regret any of it? Not even the hard times? Losing your father, those desperate days before you found Victor? Not even those. They shaped me. They taught me what was important, and they brought me to your door. Deacon squeezed her hand gently. What about you? Do you regret taking in a half-starved stranger all those years ago? That stranger became my husband, the father of my children, my partner in everything. He is the love of my life. How could I possibly regret that? Flora leaned her head on his shoulder, their familiar, comfortable position. I am grateful for every single day, Deacon, even the hard ones, especially the hard ones because they taught us how strong we are together. The sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Copper's grave, now covered in wildflowers and surrounded by a white picket fence that Deacon had built years ago, was visible from where they sat. The horse had been gone for over 30 years, but his impact remained, a reminder of where their journey had begun. Their children and grandchildren came to visit regularly, filling the house with laughter and love. Daniel ran the expanded boarding house, which now served tourists and travelers from across the country. Beatrice had published a cookbook featuring her mother's recipes, which had become popular throughout Colorado. Thomas was one of the most respected veterinarians in the state, known for his compassionate treatment of animals and his willingness to help those who could not afford his services. We built a good life, Flora said softly. A good family. We did, Deacon agreed, and it all started because you saw a man who was taking care of his horse and decided he was worth helping. And because that man had a good heart. Never forget that, Deacon. You had a good heart then, and you have a good heart now. That is what I fell in love with. They sat there until the stars emerged, a canopy of light above the mountains. The boarding house behind them was full of guests, the sound of conversation and laughter drifting through the open windows. Somewhere inside, their granddaughter was playing piano, the notes of a familiar hymn floating on the evening air. This is what happiness looks like, Deacon said, his voice filled with contentment. Right here, right now, with you. Always with you, Flora agreed. They remained on that porch until late into the night, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing. They had taken care of each other just as Flora had taken care of both Deacon and his horse all those years ago. It had been the foundation of their love. That simple act of ensuring everyone was fed and cared for, and it had carried them through 4 decades of marriage. As they finally rose to go inside, Deacon paused at Copper's grave, as he did most nights. He placed his hand on the fence and spoke softly. "Thank you, old friend, for everything." Flora took his other hand, and together they walked back to the house, to the life they had created, to the family that had grown from a chance meeting and a simple act of kindness. The boarding house stood solid and welcoming, a testament to their hard work and dedication, and inside its walls, 3 generations of their family carried on the lessons of compassion and care that Deacon and Flora had exemplified. In the years that followed, Deacon and Flora continued to be the heart of their family and community. They slowed down considerably, but they remained active in the running of the boarding house, offering advice and wisdom to Daniel and his wife. They spent their afternoons with their grandchildren, telling stories about the old days, about how Victor had been during the height of the gold rush, about Copper and the role the faithful horse had played in their love story. The grandchildren loved those stories, begging to hear them over and over. Their favorite was always the tale of how their grandfather had come to town with nothing but a horse and determination, how he had made sure Copper was fed first even when he himself was starving, and how their grandmother had seen that act and known she had found someone special. "That is how you know someone's character," Flora would tell them, "by how they treat those who cannot do anything for them in return. Your grandfather treated his horse with love and respect even when he had nothing. That told me he was a man worth knowing. And your grandmother made sure we were both taken care of," Deacon would add. "She fed me, gave me work, gave me a home, and then she gave me her heart. I have been the luckiest man alive every day since." Flora's health began to decline in 1928. She had always been strong and healthy, rarely sick, but age and a lifetime of hard work finally caught up with her. Deacon took over her care with the same devotion she had always shown him, cooking her favorite meals, reading to her in the evenings, sitting by her bedside when she was too tired to get up. "You do not have to do all this," she protested weakly one afternoon. "The children can help." "You made sure I ate well for 40 years, Deacon said, spooning soup into her mouth with gentle patience. "Let me return the favor." Flora smiled, her green eyes still bright despite her weakened state. "I love you, Deacon Xavier. Loving you has been the greatest joy of my life." "And you have been mine," Deacon replied, his voice breaking. "Everything good in my life came from you." She recovered enough to celebrate their 45th wedding anniversary in February of 1929, surrounded by family. It was a quieter celebration than their 30th, but no less meaningful. Deacon held her hand throughout the entire evening, afraid to let go, afraid that if he did, she might slip away. That summer, Flora spent most of her days on the back porch, wrapped in quilts even though the weather was warm, watching the mountains she had loved for so many years. Deacon sat beside her, holding her hand, talking about their life together, reminding her of all the beautiful moments they had shared. "Remember our first kiss?" he asked one evening. "By the stream, when you told me you loved me?" "I remember," Flora said softly. "I was so nervous. I thought maybe I had read everything wrong, that maybe you did not feel the same way. I was in love with you for months before I found the courage to say anything. I thought you were too good for me." "You were never not good enough, Deacon. You were always exactly what I needed." On a September evening in 1929, with the aspen trees just beginning to turn gold and the air carrying the first hint of autumn cold, Flora passed away peacefully in her sleep. Deacon was beside her, as he had been every night for 45 years. He held her hand until morning, unwilling to let go, saying goodbye to the woman who had saved his life and given him everything worth living for. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, a testament to the lives Deacon and Flora had touched over the decades. Former boarders came from across Colorado and beyond. People who had been given second chances spoke about the kindness and generosity of the Xaviers. Their children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren stood together, mourning the loss of the woman who had been the foundation of their family. They buried Flora next to Copper's grave under the aspen tree, just as she had requested. "I want to be near where it all started," she had told Deacon months earlier, "near the horse that brought you to me." Deacon visited her grave every day, sitting on the bench he had built there, talking to her about the family, the boarding house, the weather. He told her about their newest great-grandchild, about Daniel's plans to add electricity to the building, about how much he missed her. He lived for 3 more years, watched over carefully by his children who made sure he ate well, made sure he stayed healthy, returning the care their parents had always shown them. Deacon helped where he could with the boarding house, but mostly he spent his time with his grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories and wisdom, making sure the legacy he and Flora had built would continue. On a cold November night in 1932, Deacon Xavier passed away in his sleep just as Flora had. He was 73 years old, and he had lived a full, rich life. His children found him the next morning peaceful and still, his hand outstretched as though reaching for someone only he could see. They buried him beside Flora and Copper, 3 graves under the golden aspen tree. The headstones told a simple story. A man and his horse had come to Victor with nothing, and a woman had made sure they were both cared for. From that simple act of kindness had grown a love story that spanned nearly half a century and touched countless lives. The boarding house continued to operate for decades afterward, run by their children and grandchildren. It became a landmark in Victor, a piece of living history that attracted visitors who wanted to experience authentic Western hospitality. The story of Deacon and Flora was told and retold, becoming part of the town's folklore, an example of how love could grow from the smallest acts of compassion. Daniel Xavier ran the establishment until his own retirement in 1945, when he passed it to his eldest daughter, Rose. She modernized the building while maintaining its historical character, and she made sure that Copper's grave and her grandparents' resting place were always maintained, always decorated with fresh flowers. The fence Deacon had built remained, a permanent memorial to the horse that had changed so many lives. Beatrice Xavier's cookbook went through multiple printings and became a treasured collection of recipes that captured the spirit of Old West cooking. In the foreword, she wrote about her parents and the lessons they had taught her about taking care of others, about making sure everyone at your table was well-fed and welcome. Thomas Xavier's veterinary practice was taken over by his son, who continued the tradition of compassionate animal care. He often told clients about his grandfather and Copper, about how a man's kindness to his horse had led to a love story for the ages. The legacy of Deacon Xavier and Flora Whitmore lived on through their descendants, through the boarding house that still stood in Victor, through the stories that were passed down from generation to generation. Their great-great-grandchildren grew up hearing about how their ancestors had met, about the importance of kindness and compassion, about taking care of those you love. The tale of the man who fed his horse before himself and the woman who made sure both of them ate well became a reminder that love often starts with the smallest gestures, with simple acts of caring that reveal the true nature of a person's heart. It was a story about finding home in unexpected places, about building a life from nothing through hard work and mutual devotion, about the transformative power of seeing and being seen by another person. In Victor, Colorado, under an aspen tree that turned gold every autumn, 3 graves stood as silent testimony to a love that had conquered hunger, loneliness, and hardship. Visitors to the town often stopped there, reading the simple inscriptions, learning the story of the couple who had helped build the community and whose example continued to inspire generations. The boarding house still operated in the 21st century, now a bed and breakfast that catered to tourists exploring Colorado's mining history. The current owners, direct descendants of Deacon and Flora, maintained a small museum in the original building, displaying photographs, letters, and artifacts from the 1880s. The most popular exhibit was a photograph of Copper, along with the story of how a faithful horse had carried a desperate man to his destiny. Every February, on the anniversary of Deacon and Flora's wedding, the family gathered at the graves for a small ceremony. They brought apples and carrots for Copper, flowers for Flora, and they told the old stories once again. making sure that the youngest generation understood where they came from and what their ancestors had built through love, hard work, and an unwavering commitment to taking care of each other. The mountains still stood tall and protective around Victor, just as Flora had once described them. The town had changed dramatically from its gold rush days, but something essential remained, a spirit of community and caring that Deacon and Flora had helped establish all those years ago. Their story was one of the thousands that made up the tapestry of the American West, but it was special in its ordinariness, in the way it showed that heroism did not always come from gunfights and grand gestures. Sometimes it came from simply feeding your horse before yourself, from offering a meal to a stranger, from taking care of each other through all the days and years that followed. And so the legend lived on, passed from parent to child, from teacher to student, from one generation to the next. The man who fed his horse before he fed himself, and the woman who made sure both he and the horse ate well. A love story for the ages, rooted in the simplest and most profound truth, that caring for others, that putting their needs alongside or even above your own, is the foundation upon which lasting love is built. In the end, that was the legacy of Deacon Xavier and Flora Whitmore, not just the boarding house or the descendants or the stories, but the example they set of what it means to truly love another person. They had taken care of each other in sickness and health, in poverty and relative prosperity, through loss and joy, for 45 years of marriage, and every day thereafter in the hearts and memories of those they left behind. They had built something beautiful from nothing, had created a family and a home, and a life worth living. And it had all started on a desperate day in 1883 when a hungry man made sure his horse was fed first, and a compassionate woman saw in that gesture everything she needed to know about his character. From that moment forward, they had walked through life together, hand in hand, heart to heart, building something that would outlast them both and continue to inspire long after they were gone. That was the story of Deacon and Flora Xavier. That was the story of how love could blossom in the most unlikely circumstances, how kindness could change lives, and how a simple commitment to taking care of each other could create a legacy that would endure for generations. It was a story of the American West, but more than that, it was a story of the human heart and its infinite capacity for love, compassion, and devotion. And beneath the aspen tree in Victor, Colorado, where 3 graves stood side by side, their spirits rested together, reunited in whatever comes after this life, their love story complete and perfect and eternal.